The dust settled around Sarah Mitchell's boots as she stepped onto the weathered porch of her father's trading post, her eyes scanning the horizon where the Arizona sun was bleeding into the distant mesas. 3 years of running this place alone had taught her to read the desert's moods, and tonight something felt different. The air hung heavy with the kind of stillness that preceded either a storm or trouble, and out here on the edge of Apache territory, those two things often arrive together. She was reaching for the broom to sweep away the day's accumulation of red dirt when she saw him. A solitary figure on horseback, moving with the fluid grace of someone born to the saddle, emerging from the heat shimmer like a mirage taking solid form. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to the rifle propped beside the door, her father's old Winchester that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Living on the frontier had stripped away whatever naivety she'd brought from Boston, replacing it with the hard-earned wisdom that survival often depended on being faster than your fear. The rider drew closer, and Sarah felt her breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with caution and everything to do with a recognition she couldn't quite name. He sat tall in the saddle, his long dark hair caught back with a leather cord, his features carved with the stark beauty of the high desert itself. He wore a mixture of traditional Apache clothing and pieces acquired from the white man's world, a patchwork that spoke of someone navigating between two existences. When his eyes met hers across the dusty yard, something electric passed between them, a current that made her fingers tighten on the rifle stock even as her pulse quickened. He raised one hand in a gesture of peace, then dismounted with an economy of movement that spoke of absolute confidence in his own body. Sarah had seen plenty of men pass through her trading post in the years since her father's death, drifters and soldiers and prospectors all chasing their various fortunes across this unforgiving landscape. But none of them had looked at her the way this stranger was looking at her now, with eyes that seemed to see past the practical calico dress and sun-weathered skin to something deeper, something she'd almost forgotten existed beneath her armor of self-reliance. "The trading post is closed for the evening," she called out, pleased that her voice remained steady, despite the unexpected hammering of her heart. "You can water your horse at the trough and be on your way," he smiled then, a slow curve of his mouth that transformed his entire face, softening the warrior's edge without diminishing the strength beneath it. "I'm not here to trade," he said, his English flawless but carrying the musical cadence of his native tongue beneath it. "My name is Taze. I'm looking for Sarah Mitchell." The sound of her own name in his mouth sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. Sarah lowered the rifle slightly, though she didn't set it aside entirely. "I'm Sarah Mitchell. What business could you possibly have with me?" Taze took a step closer, his movements deliberate and unthreatening, and Sarah noticed the way the fading sunlight caught the copper tones in his skin, the play of muscle beneath his shirt as he moved. "Your father made a promise to my people before he died," he said, "a promise that needs to be honored. May I approach? What I have to say shouldn't be shouted across a yard like strangers bargaining over goods." Every instinct Sarah had developed during her years of independence screamed at her to maintain the distance, to keep the barrier of space and the rifle between herself and this unsettling stranger. But something else stirred within her, something that recognized in Tazi's steady gaze and quiet confidence a kindred spirit who understood what it meant to stand alone against the world's expectations. Against her better judgment, she found herself nodding, stepping back from the doorway in silent invitation. As Taze climbed the steps to the porch, Sarah became acutely aware of just how tall he was, how his presence seemed to fill the space around him without any apparent effort. He stopped a respectful distance away, close enough that she could see the intelligence in his dark eyes, the strength in his hands as they rested calmly at his sides. Those hands looked capable of both violence and tenderness, and Sarah found herself wondering, with an intensity that startled her, which she would encounter if she dared to find out. "Your father understood that our peoples don't have to be enemies," Taze began, his voice low and measured. "He worked to build bridges when others were busy burning them. Before the fever took him, he promised to help my band find a way to live in peace, to navigate the changing world without losing everything we are. He was gathering evidence of treaty violations, documenting the corruption of the Indian agent who's been stealing our rations and selling them for profit. Sarah felt her chest tighten at the mention of her father's fever. The 3 terrible days she'd spent watching him slip away while the nearest doctor was 2 days' ride distant. She'd known her father was respected by the local Apache bands, had seen the way they came to trade with him when they avoided other white settlements. But she hadn't known about any promises, any investigations into official corruption. "My father never mentioned any of this to me," she said carefully. "If he made such a promise, he took the details to his grave." Tazi's expression softened with what might have been sympathy. "He was protecting you. The Indian agent, Crawford, is a dangerous man. Your father was gathering evidence carefully, quietly, but the sickness came before he could finish." He paused, and when he spoke again, his words carried the weight of a plea, disguised as a simple statement. "I need your help to complete what he started. Without that evidence, my people will continue to starve on what should be our own land. Children will die this winter because men like Crawford see us as nothing more than an opportunity for profit." The sun had nearly disappeared now, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, and in the gathering darkness Sarah could see the determination etched into every line of Tazi's face. She thought of her father, of his quiet conviction that justice mattered more than convenience, that standing up for what was right was worth the personal cost. She'd inherited his trading post, his skill with numbers and negotiations, his ability to read the truth in a man's eyes. Had she also inherited his sense of responsibility to something larger than her own survival? "If I agree to help you," Sarah heard herself saying, the words emerging before caution could stop them, "it can't be tonight. I need time to search through my father's papers, to understand what we're dealing with." She met Tazi's eyes directly, refusing to look away despite the way his gaze seemed to reach inside her. "And I need to know I can trust you. My father's faith in your people isn't enough? I need to see for myself who you are." Something shifted in the air between them then, a recognition of the challenge laid down and accepted. Tazi moved closer, just one step, but it brought him near enough that Sarah could smell the desert sage on his clothing, could see the pulse beating in his throat. When he raised his hand, slowly enough that she could have stepped back if she'd chosen to, Sarah found herself frozen in place, her heart pounding as his fingers barely brushed her cheek, a touch so light it might have been imagined except for the trail of fire it left across her skin. "Tomorrow night," he said softly, his breath warm against her face. "I'll return at sundown and you can tell me what you've decided. But know this, Sarah Mitchell, your father saw clearly what many choose to ignore. The question now is whether you have his courage, or whether fear will make you turn away from what your heart already knows is right." Then he was gone, stepping back and moving down the stairs with that same fluid grace, mounting his horse and disappearing into the purple twilight as quickly as he'd appeared. Sarah stood on the porch long after the sound of hoofbeats had faded, her hand pressed to her cheek where his fingers had touched, her mind spinning with questions that had no easy answers. She thought about resistance and surrender, about the way a single touch could promise more than 1,000 words, about the choice that lay before her like an uncharted trail leading into dangerous country. Inside the trading post, among her father's carefully organized papers and ledgers, lay secrets that could change everything. And tomorrow night, when Tazi returned, Sarah would have to decide whether she was brave enough to follow where those secrets led, even if the path took her places she'd never imagined going. The Apache stranger with his knowing eyes and gentle hands had awakened something in her that 3 years of solitary survival had kept safely buried. Now, as the stars emerged above the desert, Sarah found herself wondering not whether she could resist the call to adventure and justice and something deeper she didn't yet have words for, but whether she even wanted to try. The morning arrived with the cruel brightness particular to the Arizona desert, sunlight flooding through the trading post windows and illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air like tiny spirits. Sarah had barely slept, her night filled with restless dreams of dark eyes and whispered promises, of her father's face superimposed over ledgers filled with damning numbers. She'd risen before dawn, made coffee strong enough to strip paint, and now stood before the old trunk in the back room where her father had kept his private papers, the key heavy in her palm. The trunk's hinges protested as she lifted the lid, revealing the accumulated documentation of Samuel Mitchell's life on the frontier. There were letters from her mother, written before the cholera had claimed her when Sarah was barely 12. There were land deeds and trading licenses, certificates, and contracts that represented the legitimate face of her father's business. But Sarah knew her father well enough to understand that the real secrets wouldn't be lying on top where any casual searcher might find them. She began removing items carefully, setting them aside as she worked her way deeper into the trunk's contents. It was nearly noon when her fingers found the false bottom, a cunningly crafted compartment that revealed itself only when she pressed on a specific corner in just the right way. Inside lay 3 leather-bound journals and a collection of papers wrapped in oilcloth. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she lifted them out, carrying them to her father's old desk and spreading them in the sunlight. The journals were dated, covering the last 2 years of her father's life, and as Sarah began to read, a picture emerged that was far more complex and dangerous than she'd imagined. Her father had been meticulous in his documentation. He'd recorded every delivery of supplies meant for the Apache reservation, noting the quantities promised by government contract and comparing them to what actually arrived. The discrepancies were staggering. Month after month, the supplies that were supposed to feed and clothe the Apache people had been systematically diverted, sold to other merchants and settlements, while the Indian agent, a man named Elijah Crawford, pocketed the profits. Her father had names, dates, and in some cases, actual bills of sale that proved Crawford's theft. But that wasn't all. As Sarah continued reading, she discovered that Crawford wasn't working alone. He had confederates in the territorial government, men who were supposed to provide oversight but who instead helped conceal his crimes in exchange for a share of the profits. Her father had been building a case that could have brought down not just one corrupt agent, but an entire network of officials who saw the Apache people as nothing more than an inconvenience to be exploited or eliminated. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind reeling with the implications. No wonder her father had kept this secret from her. Knowledge like this was dangerous, potentially deadly. Crawford and his associates wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who threatened their lucrative arrangement. A trading post fire, an accident on the trail, a confrontation gone wrong, there were 1,000 ways to make problems disappear on the frontier, where law was more suggestion than guarantee. The sound of approaching horses pulled Sarah from her dark thoughts. She quickly gathered the journals and papers, returning them to their hiding place before moving to the window. Her stomach clenched when she recognized the lead rider, Elijah Crawford himself, flanked by 2 rough-looking men who had the unmistakable bearing of hired guns rather than legitimate law enforcement. Crawford was a heavy-set man in his 50s, his face florid and his small eyes perpetually calculating. He'd been to the trading post before, always making Sarah vaguely uncomfortable with the way his gaze lingered on her and the proprietary air he adopted when discussing Indian affairs. Sarah forced herself to breathe normally as she walked to the door, painting on the pleasant but impersonal expression she'd perfected for dealing with difficult customers. "Mr. Crawford," she called out as they dismounted, "this is unexpected." "What brings you all the way out here?" Crawford climbed the steps with the labored breathing of a man unused to physical exertion, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Miss Mitchell, always a pleasure to see you." "I hope we're not interrupting your business," he gestured to his companions, who remained at the base of the steps, their hands resting casually near their gun belts. "Just making my rounds, checking in with the merchants who trade with the reservation Indians. Have to make sure everyone's following proper procedures, you understand." There was something in his tone that made Sarah's instincts flare with warning. This wasn't a casual visit. Crawford was fishing for something, though she couldn't yet tell what. "My procedures are the same as my father's," she said carefully. "Everything documented, everything fair and square." "Would you like to inspect my ledgers?" "That won't be necessary," Crawford said. But his eyes were already scanning the interior of the trading post, taking inventory of everything visible. "I'm actually more interested in any papers or documents your father might have left behind. Official communications, records of his dealings with the Apache, that sort of thing. As the territorial Indian agent, I need to make sure all documentation regarding native affairs is properly filed with my office." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her expression neutral. My father kept meticulous business records, but I'm not aware of any official documents that should concern your office. He ran a trading post, Mr. Crawford, not a government agency. Crawford's smile thinned, becoming something harder and less pleasant. Your father had a lot of contact with the Apache, Miss Mitchell, more than most white folks find comfortable. There's been talk that he might have been involving himself in matters beyond simple trade. I'd hate to discover that someone in your position was harboring information relevant to territorial security. The threat was barely veiled, and Sarah felt anger beginning to burn through her caution. Before she could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal too much, one of Crawford's men called out from the yard. "Boss, we got company." Everyone turned to see a group of Apache riders approaching, perhaps a dozen strong, moving in a loose formation that could shift into defensive positions in an instant if needed. Sarah recognized several faces from previous trading visits, but her attention fixed immediately on the figure riding slightly ahead of the others. Taizé sat his horse with casual authority, his presence commanding attention without any apparent effort. His eyes met Sarah's for just a moment, long enough for her to see the warning there, before turning to Crawford with an expression of courteous neutrality. "Agent Crawford," Taizé said, his tone perfectly polite and absolutely devoid of warmth. "I'm surprised to find you so far from your office. I thought you were too busy with administrative duties to visit the people you're supposed to serve." Crawford's face reddened, his hand moving involuntarily toward the pistol at his belt, before he apparently thought better of it. He was outnumbered and likely outgunned by the Apache warriors, and they both knew it. "I wasn't aware the Apache had appointed you as their spokesman, Taizé. Last I checked, you were just another reservation Indian who should be grateful for the government's generosity." The tension in the air ratcheted up several notches, and Sarah saw Tazi's companions shifting in their saddles, reading themselves for whatever might come next. But Taizé himself remained calm, even allowing a slight smile to cross his features. "The government's generosity seems to arrive in quantities much smaller than the contracts promise," he said mildly. "But perhaps Miss Mitchell can help with that. We've come to trade for supplies if she's willing to do business with us." Sarah understood immediately what Taizé was doing. By establishing a legitimate reason for his presence and the presence of his companions, he was making it much harder for Crawford to cause trouble without revealing his own corrupt interests. If Crawford objected to Apache people trading at a licensed trading post, he'd have to explain why, and that explanation might raise questions he didn't want asked. "I'm always willing to do honest business," Sarah said, moving to stand beside the porch railing where both Crawford and Taizé could see her clearly. "My father built his reputation on fair dealing, and I intend to maintain it. Mr. Crawford, unless you have official business that requires my immediate attention, I have customers waiting." Crawford looked between Sarah and Taizé, his expression caught between anger and calculation. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision, gesturing to his men to mount up. "We'll continue this conversation another time, Miss Mitchell, but I'd advise you to be careful about the company you keep. The frontier can be a dangerous place for a woman alone, especially one who doesn't understand the complexities of Indian relations." As Crawford and his men rode away, Sarah released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The Apache warriors dismounted, some moving to tend their horses, while others began examining the goods displayed outside the trading post. But Taizé came directly to the porch, climbing the steps until he stood close enough that they could speak quietly without being overheard. "You've read your father's papers," he said, "and it wasn't a question." Sarah nodded. "Every word. It's worse than you told me. Crawford isn't just stealing rations, he's part of a larger conspiracy. My father had evidence that could destroy him and several other officials." She paused, studying Tazi's face, seeing the weight of responsibility and barely controlled anger in his expression. "Crawford knows something. That visit wasn't coincidence." "No," Taizé agreed. "Someone has been watching you, watching for any sign that you might pick up where your father left off. Crawford is getting nervous, which makes him more dangerous." His hand moved, almost unconsciously, to rest on the porch railing near Sarah's own hand, not quite touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his skin. "You need to decide now, Sarah. If you help us, you become Crawford's enemy. There's no middle ground, no safe position. He'll come after you with everything he has." Sarah looked out across the yard, watching Tazi's companions as they moved with the easy confidence of men completely at home in their environment. She thought about her father, about the promises he'd made and the principles he'd died upholding. She thought about Crawford's veiled threats and the comfortable corruption that allowed men like him to profit from others' suffering. And she thought about the touch of Tazi's hand on her cheek the night before, the promise of something more than the lonely existence she'd been enduring. "I've already decided," she said quietly, turning to meet Tazi's eyes directly. "My father didn't gather this evidence just to have it gather dust after he died. He wanted justice, wanted to protect your people from predators like Crawford. I can't walk away from that, even if it would be safer." She allowed herself a small, rueful smile. "Besides, I stopped looking for the safe path a long time ago. Safe doesn't keep you alive out here. Smart does, and staying flexible and knowing when to trust your instincts." Tazi's expression softened, something like relief flickering across his features before being replaced by renewed determination. "Then we need to move quickly. Crawford's visit means he's planning something. I have contacts, people who can help us get your father's evidence to officials who can't be bought. But we'll need to move the documents somewhere safe. Somewhere Crawford can't reach them even if he burns your trading post to the ground." The casual mention of burning brought home the reality of what Sarah was committing to. This wasn't a simple business transaction or even a straightforward moral choice. This was war fought in shadows and secrets, where the stakes were measured in lives rather than dollars. She felt a moment of fear, sharp and clarifying, before it transformed into something fiercer and more focused. "There's a line shack about 10 miles north of here," she said, her mind already racing through the logistics. "My father used it during roundup season. It's isolated, defendable, and Crawford doesn't know about it. We could move the documents there, along with supplies in case we need to hole up for a while." Taze nodded, already turning to signal his companions with a series of subtle hand gestures that spoke of long practice and absolute trust. "We'll help you pack what you need. We should move before dark, use the twilight to cover our trail. Once the documents are secure, we can plan our next steps." As the Apache warriors moved into coordinated action, helping Sarah gather supplies and preparing for the journey ahead, she felt the weight of her decision settling over her like a cloak. There would be no going back from this point. She was committed to a path that would likely cost her everything she'd worked to build, might cost her life if Crawford proved as ruthless as she suspected. But as Taze moved past her, his hand brushing hers in a touch that seemed to carry both reassurance and promise, Sarah found she had no regrets. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when they finally rode out, Sarah on her father's old roan horse, surrounded by Apache warriors who moved like shadows across the desert landscape. Taze rode beside her, close enough that their legs occasionally brushed as the horses picked their way along the narrow trail. Every touch sent awareness crackling through Sarah's body, a constant reminder of the attraction that hummed between them like a plucked string. "What made you decide to trust me?" Taze asked as they navigated a particularly rocky section of the path. "Last night, you looked at me like I might be a threat. Today, you're riding into the wilderness with a dozen Apache warriors, carrying evidence that could get us all killed." Sarah considered the question, searching for words to explain the instinct that had guided her decision. "I trusted my father's judgment," she said finally. "He believed in your people, believed in you specifically, or he wouldn't have made the promises he did. But more than that, I recognize something in you. You're fighting for something bigger than yourself, willing to put yourself at risk for people who depend on you. I understand that kind of responsibility, and I think you understand it in me." Taze was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something deeper than simple appreciation. "Your father told me once that you were the strongest person he'd ever known. He said you had your mother's beauty and his stubbornness, combined with a courage that was entirely your own. I thought he was exaggerating, the way fathers do when they speak of their children. But he was right. You're remarkable, Sarah Mitchell." The words settled over Sarah like a physical touch, warming places inside her that had been cold for far too long. She glanced at Taze, finding him already watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was desire in his gaze, yes, but also respect and something that might have been wonder, as though he couldn't quite believe she was real. We barely know each other, Sarah said, but even she could hear the weakness in the protest. Yesterday, you were a stranger. Today, we're conspirators in a dangerous game. Tomorrow, who knows what we'll be to each other. Does it matter? Taze asked, and there was no doubt or hesitation in his voice. Sometimes knowing happens faster than time would suggest. I knew who you were the moment I saw you standing on that porch with your rifle and your defiance. I knew I would either win your trust or spend the rest of my life regretting that I'd failed to try. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs, felt the desert heat mixing with the warmth that spread through her body at Tazi's words. She was playing a dangerous game on multiple fronts now, risking not just her safety but her carefully guarded heart. And yet, as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, as they rode deeper into territory where the rules of the frontier gave way to something older and more fundamental, Sarah found she had no desire to retreat behind her defenses. The line shack appeared as darkness began to gather, a rough structure built from local stone and weathered timber, small but solid and positioned to command a view of the surrounding terrain. As the Apache warriors secured the perimeter and began unloading supplies, Taze helped Sarah dismount, his hands on her waist lingering a moment longer than strictly necessary. The touch sent heat racing through her veins, and when she looked up to meet his eyes, she saw her own desire reflected there, mixed with a question he was too honorable to voice without invitation. Tonight would bring decisions of a different kind than those Sarah had faced in her father's trading post. Tonight, in this isolated place with the desert stars emerging overhead and the promise of danger lurking beyond the firelight, she would have to decide whether to maintain the walls she'd built around her heart or allow them to crumble before the intensity of Tazi's regard. And as his fingers traced the line of her jaw with a gentleness that made her tremble, Sarah already knew what her answer would be. The interior of the line shack was sparse but serviceable. A single room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, and narrow windows positioned to provide sight lines in all directions. While Tazi's companions established a watch rotation and settled in for the night, Sarah and Taze worked together to organize her father's documents, spreading them across the small table and sorting them by date and relevance. The work created an illusion of normalcy, of simple cooperation toward a shared goal, but the awareness crackling between them made every accidental touch feel charged with significance. Your father was more thorough than I realized, Taze said, examining a particularly detailed ledger that compared promised shipments against actual deliveries. This evidence is damning. Crawford must know these documents exist. That's why he's getting desperate. Sarah nodded, her attention nominally on the papers before her, but her awareness centered on Tazi's presence, the way his shoulder nearly brushed hers as they worked in the confined space. The question is how to use this information without getting killed in the process. Crawford has money, connections, and men willing to do his dirty work. We have the truth, but truth doesn't stop bullets. No, Taze agreed. But truth can win battles that bullets can't. My people have learned that survival sometimes requires fighting with different weapons than our enemies expect. He set down the ledger he'd been examining and turned to face Sarah directly, his expression serious. But I won't lie to you about the dangers. Crawford is cornered, and cornered animals are the most vicious. Once we move against him, there's no guarantee we'll survive the consequences. The firelight cast dancing shadows across Tazi's features, highlighting the strong lines of his face and the intensity in his dark eyes. Sarah found herself mesmerized by the play of light and shadow, by the barely leashed power she sensed in him, the combination of warrior's strength and unexpected gentleness that had drawn her from the moment they'd met. I stopped expecting guarantees when my mother died, Sarah said quietly. Out here, survival is always provisional, always balanced on the edge of a knife. You do your best, make your choices, and hope you're still standing when the dust settles. She moved closer to Taze, drawn by a force she no longer wanted to resist. But some things are worth the risk. Some causes demand that we stand up even when the odds are against us. Tazi's hand rose to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with a reverence that made Sarah's breath catch. And some people make you believe in possibilities you'd given up on, he said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. When I rode to your trading post yesterday, I was thinking only of my people's needs, of justice and survival. I wasn't prepared for you, Sarah. Wasn't prepared for the way you'd make me feel like the world had suddenly expanded beyond the narrow boundaries I'd accepted. Sarah's hands found their way to Tazi's chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms, the warmth of his skin through the fabric of his shirt. Every point of contact between them felt electric, alive with potential and promise. "I've been alone for so long," she admitted, the words coming easier than they should have, as though Tazi's presence had unlocked something carefully guarded inside her. "I learned to be strong, to need no one, to build walls that kept me safe. But walls also keep you isolated, cut off from the connections that make life more than just survival." "Then let them fall," Tazi murmured, and there was no doubt in his voice. No hesitation in the way he drew her closer until their bodies aligned, until Sarah could feel the heat of him seeping into her bones. "Let me in, Sarah. Let me show you that strength doesn't require solitude, that trust can be its own kind of courage." When their lips met, it was like a spark touching tinder, igniting something that had been building between them from that first charged moment on the trading post porch. Sarah had been kissed before, had experienced the awkward fumblings of eager young men and the calculating approaches of those who saw her as a means to acquiring property or status. But nothing had prepared her for the way Tazi kissed her, with a combination of passion and restraint that spoke of deep respect layered over fierce desire. His hands moved into her hair, scattering the pins that held it in its practical bun, letting the waves tumble free across her shoulders. Sarah gasped at the intimacy of the gesture, at the vulnerability of being so completely seen and touched. Her own hand slid up to circle Tazi's neck, pulling him closer, deepening the kiss until she felt dizzy with the taste and feel of him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Tazi rested his forehead against Sarah's, his hands framing her face with infinite gentleness. "I should apologize for moving too fast," he said, though the raggedness of his breathing suggested his heart was no more steady than hers. "Should give you time, space to be certain this is what you want." Sarah laughed, the sound surprising her with its freedom, its genuine joy. "I'm a grown woman who's been making her own decisions for years," she said, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw, memorizing the texture of his skin. "Don't you dare apologize for treating me like someone capable of knowing my own mind and heart." She paused, suddenly serious, needing him to understand the significance of what she was offering. "I want this, Tazi, I want you. Not because I'm caught up in the danger or the drama, but because when I look at you, I see someone who understands what it means to stand against the world for something you believe in. Someone who knows the cost of courage and pays it anyway." Tazi's expression softened with something that looked like wonder mixed with fierce protectiveness. "You honor me," he said simply, "more than you can know. My people and yours have been taught to fear each other, to see only differences and reasons for conflict. But you look at me and see a man, not a threat or a curiosity. That gift is rarer than gold, Sarah Mitchell." They kissed again, slower this time, savoring the discovery of each other. Sarah felt herself melting into Tazi's embrace, felt the careful control she'd maintained for so long dissolving under the warmth of his touch. His hands moved with respectful exploration, tracing the curves of her body through her dress, awakening sensations she'd almost forgotten could exist. When his fingers found the buttons at the back of her dress, he paused, pulling back to search her eyes for permission. "Are you sure?" he asked, and the vulnerability in his voice, the evidence that he too was affected by what was building between them, made Sarah's decision easy. "Unsure," she whispered and helped him with the buttons, her own fingers surprisingly steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. The night that followed was a revelation, a slow unveiling of intimacy and trust that went far beyond the merely physical. Tazi approached lovemaking the way he seemed to approach everything, with a combination of intense focus and genuine care that made Sarah feel cherished in a way she'd never experienced. His hands explored her body with reverence, learning the map of her skin, finding places that made her gasp and arch into his touch. When they finally joined together, moving in a rhythm as old as the desert itself, Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her, walls crumbling that she'd thought were permanent fixtures of her heart. Afterward, wrapped in Tazi's arms with the firelight painting golden patterns on the rough walls, Sarah felt a peace she hadn't known in years. Tazi's fingers traced idle patterns on her bare shoulder, his breathing steady and even against her hair. For a while, they simply existed together in comfortable silence, the weight of the world held temporarily at bay by the cocoon of their shared intimacy. "Tell me about your mother," Sarah said eventually, curious about the life that had shaped the remarkable man holding her. About growing up between two worlds, never quite belonging to either one. Taze was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts, and when he spoke his voice carried the weight of old pain mixed with hard-won acceptance. "My mother was full Apache, a woman of strength and dignity who never compromised her identity even when the world demanded it. My father was a white man, a soldier who fell in love with her during a time of supposed peace. Their marriage was accepted by neither his people nor hers, but they built a life anyway, carved out a space where love mattered more than the prejudices that surrounded them." Sarah shifted to look up at Tazi's face, seeing the shadows of old grief in his expression. "What happened to them?" "They died when I was 15, Taze said, his arms tightening around Sarah as though the memory still had the power to wound. "Caught in the crossfire of a raid that should never have happened, killed by men from both worlds they tried so hard to bridge. I was left belonging nowhere, welcomed by neither the Apache who saw my white blood as taint nor the whites who saw my Apache heritage as savage." He paused, his hand moving to tangle in Sarah's hair. "Your father was one of the few who looked past all that, who saw me as simply a man trying to find his place and his purpose." Sarah's heart ached for the lonely boy Taze had been, forced to navigate hostility and prejudice from all sides. She understood, perhaps better than most, what it meant to stand apart, to forge your own identity in the face of others' expectations. "You found your purpose," she said with quiet certainty. "Leading your people, fighting for justice, building bridges your parents would have been proud of." "Maybe," Taze allowed, a small smile crossing his features. "But tonight I found something else. Something I didn't know I was missing until I saw you standing on that porch looking like you could take on the whole frontier armed with nothing but a rifle and your own determination." His fingers traced the curve of her face with infinite tenderness. "You make me believe that the world my parents dreamed of might actually be possible, that people can look past the divisions that separate us and find common ground in shared values and genuine connection. They made love again as the fire burned low, slower and sweeter than before, taking time to explore and discover, to give and receive pleasure with equal attention." Sarah had never felt so completely known, so thoroughly seen and accepted. In Tazi's arms, she wasn't Sarah Mitchell, the lonely trading post owner, the woman who'd had to become hard to survive. She was simply Sarah, a woman discovering that strength and vulnerability could coexist, that opening your heart didn't mean weakness but rather the deepest kind of courage. Dawn was still hours away when the warning came, a soft bird call from one of the sentries that Taze immediately recognized as a signal. He was up and dressed in seconds, moving with the silent efficiency of someone trained to respond instantly to danger. Sarah grabbed her own clothes, her heart hammering as reality crashed back into their temporary sanctuary. "Riders approaching," Taze said quietly, checking his weapons with practiced ease. "Multiple men, moving deliberately. Crawford has found us faster than I expected." Sarah felt fear spike through her, but it was mixed with anger and determination. She'd known the risks, had chosen this path with open eyes. Now she would face the consequences without flinching. "How many?" she asked, reaching for the Winchester her father had taught her to shoot when she was barely tall enough to hold it steady. "At least 8, maybe more," one of Tazi's companions reported from the doorway. "They're surrounding the shack, setting up for either a siege or an assault." He looked at Taze with absolute trust, waiting for orders from the man he'd accepted as leader. Taze moved to the window, assessing the situation with a tactician's eye. The shack's position gave them some advantages, solid walls and clear sight lines, but they were outnumbered and trapped. If Crawford was willing to wait them out, supplies would become an issue. If he opted for a direct assault, the casualties would be heavy on both sides. "We could try to negotiate," Sarah suggested, though she knew it was a long shot. "Crawford doesn't know for certain that we have the documents with us. Maybe we can bluff, Buy time to get word to someone who can help? Taze shook his head, his expression grim. Crawford didn't come here to talk. He came to eliminate a threat, to make sure your father's evidence never sees the light of day. If he kills us and burns this place to the ground, he destroys the documents and eliminates the witnesses all at once. He turned from the window, his eyes finding Sarah's across the shadowed room. I'm sorry. I brought this danger to your door, pulled you into a war that isn't yours to fight. Sarah crossed to Taze, placing her hand against his chest, feeling his heart beating strong and steady beneath her palm. This war became mine the moment my father made his promise to your people. It became mine when I read his documents and understood the scope of Crawford's crimes. And it became mine last night when I chose to trust you, to believe in something bigger than my own safety. She rose on her toes to kiss him, pouring everything she felt into the contact. We face this together, whatever comes. That's what partners do. The word hung between them, heavy with meaning and promise. Partners, not just allies in a dangerous game, but something more fundamental, more lasting. Sarah saw the recognition in Tazi's eyes, saw the moment he accepted what was growing between them as something real and worth fighting for. Then we make our stand, Tazi said, his voice carrying the ring of command that made his companion straighten to attention. We defend this position, protect those documents, and trust that help will come before Crawford can overwhelm us. He began issuing orders in a mixture of Apache and English, positioning his warriors for maximum defensive advantage. As the first gray light of dawn began to touch the eastern sky, Sarah found herself at a window with her rifle, Taze beside her with his own weapon, their shoulders touching in a connection that went beyond the merely physical. Whatever happened in the coming hours would shape not just their own fates, but the future of the peace her father had died trying to build. Sarah thought of him now, of his quiet determination to do what was right regardless of the cost, and felt his spirit lending her strength. Outside, Crawford's voice rang out, amplified by a speaking trumpet. Sarah Mitchell, I know you're in there with those Apache savages. Send out Samuel Mitchell's papers and we'll let you walk away from this. Refuse and we'll burn you out and take them from your ashes. You have 10 minutes to decide. Sarah looked at Taze, saw her own resolve reflected in his steady gaze. Guess we better make these 10 minutes count, she said, checking her rifle's load with hands that barely trembled. Because I didn't come this far to surrender at the first sign of trouble. Tazi's smile was fierce and proud. That's my warrior, he said, and the possessive pronoun sent warmth flooding through Sarah's chest, despite the danger surrounding them. Let's show Crawford what happens when he underestimates the power of people fighting for something that matters. As the sun climbed higher and the standoff intensified, Sarah Mitchell found herself exactly where she was meant to be, standing shoulder to shoulder with a man she'd known for barely 2 days but trusted with her life, defending principles her father had died upholding, and discovering that sometimes the greatest acts of resistance were also the greatest expressions of love. The 10 minutes Crawford had given them passed in tense silence, broken only by the quiet sounds of Tazi's warriors checking weapons and reinforcing their defensive positions. Sarah had moved the documents to the stone fireplace, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden behind loose stones where they'd survive even if the building burned. Whatever happened, Crawford wouldn't get his hands on the evidence that could destroy him. He's not going to wait much longer, Taze said quietly, his eyes scanning the scrubland surrounding the shack. Crawford's men had taken positions behind rocks and in shallow depressions, creating a loose perimeter that could tighten into a noose at their commander's signal. When he moves, it'll be fast and brutal. He can't afford witnesses or survivors. Sarah felt her throat tighten at the implication, but she refused to let fear paralyze her. She'd faced down drunk cowboys, desperate prospectors, and the daily challenges of frontier life. She could face this too, especially with Taze beside her. How many rounds do we have? She asked, falling back on practicality as a shield against terror. Enough for a prolonged offense if we're careful with our shots, one of Tazi's companions answered. He was a lean man in his 30s named Nantage, whose calm demeanor suggested he'd faced worse situations than this. But if they rush us all at once, we'll be overwhelmed by numbers eventually. Then we make every shot count, Sarah said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Force them to pay a heavy price for every inch of ground? Sometimes that's enough to break an attacker's will. Tazi's hand found hers, squeezing briefly in a gesture of solidarity and affection. "Your father would be proud of you," he said. Standing here, fighting for what's right instead of taking the safe path Crawford offered, before Sarah could respond, Crawford's voice boomed across the clearing again. "Time's up, Miss Mitchell. Last chance to be reasonable. Walk away now and we'll forget this whole unfortunate episode. Stay, and you'll burn with your Apache friends." Sarah moved to the window, showing herself deliberately despite Tazi's sound of protest. "I'm my father's daughter, Crawford," she shouted back. "And my father taught me that some things matter more than personal safety. Your corruption ends today, one way or another. The evidence of your crimes is already being delivered to territorial authorities who can't be bought or intimidated. Kill us all, and you just add murder to your list of offenses." It was a bluff, a desperate gambit to make Crawford think twice about his next move. The documents were still hidden in the fireplace, not en route to anyone. But Crawford couldn't be certain that Sarah and Taze hadn't already made contingency plans. The silence that followed was broken by the crack of a rifle, the bullet slamming into the wall several inches from where Sarah stood. She dropped instinctively, her heart hammering as Taze pulled her away from the window. "He's made his choice," Taze said grimly, and then all hell broke loose. Crawford's men opened fire from multiple positions, bullets thudding into the shack's walls and shattering the small windows. The Apache warriors returned fire with disciplined precision, each shot carefully aimed rather than wasted in wild spraying. Sarah found her position at a window facing south, sighting down her rifle's barrel at a man trying to advance under covering fire from his companions. She squeezed the trigger, felt the weapon's familiar kick against her shoulder, and watched the man stumble and fall back behind cover. The firefight settled into a grim rhythm, Crawford's men trying to close the distance while Tazi's warriors picked them off with devastating accuracy. Sarah reloaded and fired, her hands moving with mechanical efficiency even as her mind screamed at the reality of what was happening. She was in a battle for her life, killing or being killed by men she'd never met over documents that exposed corruption in a system that was supposed to serve justice. "They're bringing up torches," Nantage called out, his voice sharp with warning. 3 of Crawford's men were advancing with burning brands, clearly intending to set the shack ablaze and force its defenders into the open where they could be cut down. Taze issued rapid orders in Apache, and his warriors concentrated their fire on the men with torches. 2 went down, their brands guttering out in the dirt. But the 3rd made it close enough to hurl his torch onto the shack's roof, where the dry timber caught almost immediately. Smoke began to filter into the room, stinging Sarah's eyes and making breathing difficult. "We need to abandon this position," Taze said, already moving toward the back wall where a window faced toward a rocky outcropping. "We make a break for those rocks, use them as cover while we circle around and try to break through their line." It was a desperate plan, but Sarah could see no alternative. The fire was spreading rapidly, and soon the interior would be untenable. She grabbed a satchel containing her father's most crucial documents, the ones she'd removed from the fireplace when the shooting started, slinging it across her body. If she died, at least she'd die with the evidence still in her possession rather than letting Crawford destroy it. Taze went first, smashing out the remaining glass and dropping through in a controlled fall that turned into a sprint toward the rocks. His warriors followed at intervals, providing covering fire for each other in a coordinated movement that spoke of practiced teamwork. Sarah waited her turn, her heart in her throat as she watched bullets kicking up dust around Tazi's running form. Then it was her turn. She squeezed through the window, dropped to the ground, and ran like she'd never run before, her legs pumping as gunfire erupted around her. She felt something tug at her sleeve, hot and close, but didn't slow down. 20 yards to the rocks, 15, 10, Taze was there, reaching for her, his face taut with fear for her safety. Sarah threw herself the final distance, tumbling into the dubious shelter of the outcropping and landing hard against Tazi's chest. His arms wrapped around her immediately, and for a brief moment the chaos of the battle faded into the background, leaving only the reality of his embrace and the knowledge that they were both still alive. "Everyone make it?" Taze called out, still holding Sarah close. "All accounted for," Nantage confirmed. 2 wounded, but still fighting. We're down to about 20 rounds per man. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. They were outnumbered, low on ammunition, and pinned down by covering fire from Crawford's men. The shack behind them was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the morning sky like an accusation. Sarah felt despair beginning to edge into her consciousness, the reality of their desperate situation pressing down like a physical weight. Then, from the north came the sound of more gunfire, but this time directed at Crawford's positions rather than at the defenders. Sarah lifted her head, confused, and saw a sight that made hope flare in her chest. A group of riders was approaching at full gallop, at least 20 strong, and they were firing on Crawford's men from behind. "That's Marshal Holbrook," Sarah gasped, recognizing the territorial marshal's distinctive gray horse. "But how? How did he know to come?" Taze was already moving, taking advantage of the confusion among Crawford's ranks to coordinate a counterattack with his warriors. "Does it matter?" he called back to Sarah. "Sometimes help arrives exactly when you need it most. Come on." The next several minutes were chaos of the most visceral kind. Crawford's men, caught between two forces and losing their numerical advantage, began to break and run. Some threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. Others tried to fight their way clear and were brought down by the marshal's deputies or by Apache, warriors who'd endured months of abuse and stolen rations. Sarah saw Crawford himself trying to escape on horseback, spurring his mount toward a gap in the closing net of lawmen and warriors. Without thinking, she raised her rifle and fired, the bullet taking Crawford's horse in the shoulder and sending it crashing to the ground. Crawford tumbled free but was immediately surrounded by Marshal Holbrook's deputies, his hands jerked behind his back and secured with iron cuffs. As the gunfire died away and the smoke began to clear, Sarah found herself once again in Tazi's arms, both of them shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. Around them, wounded men were being tended to. Prisoners were being secured, and the burning shack collapsed in on itself with a crash of timbers and a shower of sparks. Marshal Holbrook dismounted and strode toward them, his weathered face creased with concern. "Miss Mitchell, are you hurt?" Sarah shook her head, unable to trust her voice for a moment. When she did speak, it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I'm fine, but how did you know? How did you know to come?" Holbrook's expression softened with something like sadness. "Your father sent me a letter 6 weeks before he died, told me what he was working on, and asked me to keep an eye on you if anything happened to him. I've been watching, waiting for Crawford to make his move. When my sources reported he was riding out here with hired guns, I put together a posse and came as fast as we could." He paused, looking at the still burning remains of the shack. "Looks like we almost came too late." "Almost doesn't count when you arrive in time to save lives," Taze said, extending his hand to the marshal. "My people owe you a debt, Marshal Holbrook. You've done what few white lawmen would do, treated Apache lives as worth defending." Holbrook shook Tazi's hand firmly. "I treat all lives as worth defending, son. That's what the badge is supposed to mean, even if men like Crawford forget it." He turned his attention back to Sarah. "I'm going to need those documents your father gathered, Miss Mitchell. The evidence that'll send Crawford and his accomplices to prison for a long time." Sarah retrieved the satchel, handing it over with fingers that trembled slightly now that the danger had passed. "It's all there, everything my father documented. Months of theft, corruption, and conspiracy. Enough to bring down not just Crawford, but the network of officials who helped him." As Marshal Holbrook examined the documents, his expression growing darker with each page he reviewed, Sarah leaned into Tazi's embrace, feeling the solid reality of his presence anchoring her to the moment. They'd survived, both of them, against odds that had seemed impossible. The evidence was safe, justice would be served, and the promises her father had made would be honored. But as she looked around at the wounded, at the burning ruins of the shack, at the prisoners being loaded into wagons for transport to jail, Sarah understood that this victory had come at a price. The frontier had demanded blood and sacrifice, and they'd paid in full measure. The question now was what they would build from the ashes. What kind of future could be forged from the painful present? Taze seemed to sense her thoughts, his arms tightening around her as he whispered against her hair. "It's over, Sarah. The immediate danger is past. Now we can start thinking about what comes next, about building something better on the foundation your father laid." Sarah nodded, allowing herself to rest against Taziz's strength, to draw comfort from the steady beating of his heart beneath her ear. The sun was climbing higher now, burning away the smoke and revealing the full scope of the morning's violence. But it was also illuminating the path forward, the possibility of a future where justice prevailed over corruption, where different peoples could work together toward common goals. "What comes next," Sarah said quietly, "is we make sure this evidence reaches people who will act on it. We see Crawford and his accomplices face trial and punishment. And then—" She paused, tilting her head back to meet Tazi's eyes, seeing her own hope reflected there. "Then we figure out what we are to each other, what we can build together." Tazi's smile was like sunrise after a long night, warm and full of promise. "I already know what you are to me," he said. "You're the woman who stood beside me when running would have been easier, who risked everything for principles and promises that weren't even originally hers to keep, who looked past all the reasons we shouldn't work and saw all the reasons we could." He kissed her then, gentle and sweet, a stark contrast to the violence that had surrounded them moments before. "I love you, Sarah Mitchell. I think I started loving you the moment you pointed that rifle at me and dared me to give you a reason to trust instead." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow, release rather than pain. "I love you too," she whispered. "God help me, I love you too." The weeks that followed Crawford's arrest were a whirlwind of activity and change. Marshal Holbrook took possession of all Samuel Mitchell's evidence, adding it to his own investigation of corruption in the Territorial Indian Agency. The documents proved even more damaging than Sarah had imagined, implicating not just Crawford, but 3 other officials in various territorial positions who'd been profiting from the systematic theft of Apache rations and supplies. The trial, when it finally convened in Tucson, became a sensation throughout the territory. Newspapers sent reporters to cover the proceedings, and the courtroom was packed daily with spectators eager to see powerful men brought low by their own greed. Sarah testified, describing how she'd discovered her father's hidden journals and the evidence they contained. Taze testified about the hardships his people had endured, the children who'd gone hungry while Crawford sold their allocated supplies for personal profit. The defense attorneys tried every tactic they could devise, from attacking Sarah's credibility as a woman running a business alone to suggesting that Taze and his companions had fabricated evidence to cause trouble. But the documentation was too thorough, the trail of financial transactions too clear. When the verdicts came down, they were unanimous. Guilty on all counts for Crawford and his confederates. Sarah stood in the courtroom as the sentences were read, Tazi's hand warm and steady in hers, and felt something inside her finally settle. Justice had been served. Her father's work had been completed. The promises made to Tazi's people would be honored by new officials appointed to replace the corrupt ones headed to territorial prison. Outside the courthouse, away from the crowds and the reporters, Taze pulled Sarah into his arms, kissing her with a passion that made her forget they were standing on a public street in broad daylight. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sarah saw the future written in his eyes, a future they would build together. "Come with me," Taze said, taking Sarah's hand and leading her through the bustling streets of Tucson to a quieter area on the edge of town. They climbed a small hill that overlooked the settlement, the desert stretching away in all directions, vast and beautiful and full of harsh promise. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Taze began, his gaze sweeping across the landscape. "My people need advocates, people who understand both worlds and can help us navigate the changes that are coming whether we want them or not. The old ways are disappearing, Sarah. We can fight that and lose everything. Or we can adapt while holding on to what matters most about who we are." Sarah listened, understanding that Taze was working toward something important, something that would shape both their futures. "What are you proposing?" she asked. "A new trading post," Taze said, turning to face her fully. "Built on land that belongs to both of us, positioned to serve as a bridge between the Apache bands and the white settlements. A place where fair dealing is guaranteed, where cultural exchange can happen without exploitation or fear." He paused, his hands moving to cup Sarah's face with infinite tenderness. "I'm proposing we build it together, as partners in business and in life. Marry me, Sarah. Help me create the kind of future our parents believed in." Sarah's heart felt too large for her chest, swelling with joy and love and the thrill of new possibilities. She'd come so far from the lonely woman standing on the trading post porch just weeks ago, convinced that solitary survival was the best she could hope for. Taizé had shown her a different path, one where strength came from connection rather than isolation, where vulnerability was not weakness, but the foundation of genuine intimacy. "Yes," she said, the word emerging with absolute certainty. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll build this future with you. Yes to all of it." Tazi's kiss was fierce and claiming, full of promise and passion. When they finally pulled apart, both were laughing with the pure joy of the moment. The sense that despite all the darkness and danger they'd faced, something beautiful was emerging from the ashes of the old order. The wedding took place a month later, conducted by a circuit judge who'd known Samuel Mitchell and was honored to officiate the marriage of his daughter to the Apache leader who'd fought alongside him for justice. It was a ceremony that blended traditions from both cultures, with Apache rituals of commitment woven seamlessly into the frontier custom of public vows and legal documentation. Sarah wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in a trunk she'd thought she'd never have reason to open. The ivory silk had yellowed slightly with age, but it still fit perfectly, transformed by her happiness into something radiant. Taizé wore traditional Apache wedding attire, his long hair decorated with beads and feathers, his bearing that of a warrior prince claiming his chosen bride. The celebration that followed brought together people who'd never thought to share space peacefully. Apache families mingled with white settlers, sharing food and stories, finding common ground in music and laughter. Marshall Holbrook gave a toast praising Samuel Mitchell's vision and his daughter's courage in seeing it through. Nantage and the other Apache warriors who'd stood with them during the siege sang traditional songs of blessing and prosperity. As the sun set on her wedding day, Sarah found herself alone with Taizé in the camp they'd established on the land where their new trading post would be built. The stars were emerging overhead, countless and brilliant in the clear desert air, and Sarah felt a peace she'd never known settle over her like a benediction. "Happy?" Taizé asked, pulling Sarah into his arms and swaying with her in a slow dance to music only they could hear. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Sarah admitted, resting her head against his chest and listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "A few weeks ago, I was alone, convinced that safety meant keeping everyone at arm's length. Now I'm married to a man I love beyond reason, planning to build something that could change the future for both our peoples." Tazi's arms tightened around her, his lips finding her temple in a kiss that conveyed tenderness and desire in equal measure. "You changed my life the moment you decided to trust me," he said. "You gave me hope when I'd almost forgotten what that felt like. Whatever we build here, whatever legacy we leave behind, it all starts with the courage you showed in choosing connection over isolation." They made love under the stars that night, taking their time to explore and pleasure each other with the freedom of knowing they had a lifetime ahead of them. Sarah had never felt so cherished, so completely seen and accepted. In Tazi's arms, she was both strong and vulnerable, independent and intimately connected, a woman who'd found a partner who celebrated every aspect of her complex identity. The months that followed were filled with hard work and deep satisfaction. The new trading post rose from the desert floor, a solid structure built to last, with living quarters for Sarah and Taizé and ample space for the kind of fair trading that Samuel Mitchell had championed. Word spread quickly that here was a place where Apache people could come without fear of exploitation, where white settlers could trade without worry about violence, where the old hostilities could begin to break down in the face of mutual benefit and growing respect. Sarah discovered she was pregnant on a crisp autumn morning, standing in the doorway of their trading post and watching Taizé work with a group of young Apache men who were learning English and basic arithmetic, skills that would help them navigate the changing world. She felt the flutter of life within her, tiny but unmistakable, and knew with certainty that this child would be raised in a world different from the one she and Taizé had known, a world where bridging cultures wasn't an impossible dream but a daily reality. When she told Taizé the news that evening, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He swept her into his arms with a joy that radiated from every line of his body, then gently set her down and dropped to his knees, pressing his ear against her still flat belly as though he could hear the secret growing there. "Our child," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Part Apache, part white, belonging fully to both worlds and to neither. Just like me, but growing up in a place where that's celebrated rather than condemned. Sarah ran her fingers through Tazi's hair, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Our child, she agreed. The first of many if we're blessed. Growing up seeing their parents work together, watching different peoples find common ground, learning that love is stronger than the divisions others try to impose. As her pregnancy progressed, Sarah continued to work at the trading post, her expanding belly a visible symbol of the new life being created in more ways than one. The trading post thrived, becoming a hub not just for commerce but for cultural exchange and mutual understanding. White settlers learned Apache customs and history. Apache families learned skills that would help them survive in the changing economy. Children from both communities played together, forming friendships that would last lifetimes. Sarah gave birth on a warm spring day with both an Apache midwife and the white doctor from the nearest settlement in attendance, another small bridge between worlds. The labor was long and difficult, but when she finally held her son in her arms, dark-haired and perfect, she knew every moment of pain had been worth it. Taze wept when he first held his son, tears of joy running unashamedly down his face as he marveled at the tiny miracle they'd created. "What should we name him?" he asked Sarah, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah thought of her father, of the legacy he'd left, and the promises he'd made that had set all of this in motion. "Samuel," she said. "Samuel Mitchell, after my father. But with an Apache name too, chosen by you and your people, so he carries both heritages with pride." The naming ceremony was held a week later, bringing together the communities that had come to see the trading post as a symbol of hope and possibility. The Apache elders gave the baby the name Nashoba, meaning Volf, for the strength and loyalty he would carry through life. Samuel Nashoba Mitchell, child of two worlds, symbol of a future where those worlds could peacefully coexist. Years passed in a rhythm of seasons and steady growth. The trading post expanded, adding a small school where Apache and white children learned together, a meeting hall where disputes could be settled through discussion rather than violence, and eventually a medical clinic where Sarah's second child, a daughter named Rebecca Kaya, was born with both her parents in attendance. Tazi's leadership of his Apache band grew more formal, recognized by both his own people and the territorial government as a force for stability and progress. He negotiated treaties that actually protected Apache interests, established programs that helped his people adapt to the changing economy without sacrificing their cultural identity, and served as an advisor to officials who genuinely wanted to find peaceful solutions to the region's conflicts. Sarah, for her part, became known throughout the territory as a woman who'd built something remarkable from the ashes of her father's dreams. She served on territorial committees addressing Indian affairs, wrote articles for Eastern newspapers describing the realities of frontier life and the possibilities of genuine cooperation between cultures, and raised her children to understand that their mixed heritage was a strength rather than a complication. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Sarah and Taze stood together on the porch of their trading post, watching the sun set over the desert they both loved. Their children played in the yard, Samuel teaching Rebecca how to track animals in the way his father had taught him, their laughter floating on the evening air. "Do you ever regret it?" Taze asked, pulling Sarah close against his side. "Choosing this life with all its complications and challenges? You could have taken the safe path, sold the trading post, moved back east to a comfortable life where no one would judge you for your choices." Sarah looked up at her husband, seeing the gray beginning to thread through his dark hair, the lines around his eyes that came from years of laughter and responsibility and love. She thought about the question seriously, giving it the consideration it deserved. "Not for a single moment," she said finally. "This life, these children, this work we've built together, it's more than I ever dreamed possible when I was standing on that porch 3 years ago, alone and convinced that safety required isolation. You showed me that the best kind of safety comes from connection, that true strength is found in vulnerability, that love is worth every risk." Taze kissed her, slow and sweet, a kiss that carried the history of all they'd shared and the promise of all the years still to come. "Your hands promised me hope that first night," he said against her lips. Promise me a future where the old hatreds could give way to something better. You've given me that and so much more." As the stars emerged and their children came running to be tucked into bed, Sarah felt the weight of contentment settle over her like a cherished blanket. She'd resisted the easy path and found something infinitely more valuable. She'd opened her heart to a stranger and discovered her soulmate. She'd honored her father's promises and created a legacy that would outlast them all. The trading post lights glowed warm against the gathering darkness, a beacon of hope in the vast desert, proof that bridges could be built between divided worlds, that love could triumph over prejudice, and that sometimes the most profound acts of courage were the ones that opened hearts rather than closed them. Sarah Mitchell had learned that resistance could take many forms. She'd resisted corruption and injustice, standing firm when powerful men tried to silence the truth. She'd resisted the easy path of isolation, choosing connection despite the risks. And she'd discovered that the question wasn't whether she could resist the Apache tonight, when his hands promised more than words could say. The question had been whether she was brave enough to surrender to love, to trust in possibilities that seemed impossible, to build a future that honored the past while reaching toward something better. And the answer, written in the happiness of her children, the strength of her marriage, and the thriving community they'd created together, was a resounding yes. As Sarah stood with Taze under the desert stars, their hands intertwined and their hearts beating in synchrony, she knew she'd made the right choice. Not the safe choice, not the easy choice, but the right one. And in the end, that made all the difference.